Congress was live. The insult was clear. 10 seconds, 6 words. One woman, Jasmine Crockett, turned a racist smear into a national reckoning. The setting, a televised oversight hearing where she was called unqualified for simply being who she is. But here's the question. When quiet courage slices deeper than rage, what kind of truth are we really afraid to hear? This is a story worth every second of your time. The sun beat down on South Dallas like a verdict, hard and unflinching. Car horns echoed off cracked sidewalks and children ran past murals of Dr. King and Dolores Huerta faded by time, but not memory. The city was alive, brown-black, breathing, but behind every door was a story of waiting. Waiting for housing, for hospitals, for help that never came. Jasmine Crockett knew those stories. She had walked them, argued them in court, and now she carried them into Congress like a blade. It had been less than a year since she'd been sworn in, one hand on the Bible, the other gripping every ghost her grandmother once prayed over. Jasmine hadn't come to Washington to make noise. She came to make history. But history, as she was learning, was guarded like a fortress, with old white hands, polished smiles, and rules not written in any book. In committee rooms laced with marble and hypocrisy, her voice landed like an earthquake, and every tremor came with a cost. Texas was burning. Not with flames, but with fear, new laws closing polling stations in black neighborhoods, ID requirements that overlooked entire communities, and headlines that dressed suppression in the language of security. Jasmine had read every line of the legislation. She could see through it like she saw through courtroom lies. This isn't about fraud, she told her chief of staff. It's about fear of who's finally voting. She knew because she had been feared her entire life. The halls of Congress were quieter than the neighborhoods she grew up in, but they were no less violent. Here the weapons were different, silence, exclusion-coded language. She remembered the sneer one colleague gave her after a criminal justice hearing, the way he lingered on her name like it didn't belong there. She remembered the press calling her fiery after a speech full of citations and calm. The bar was never where it should have been. She carried herself like a judge and still got treated like a defendant. But on the quiet nights when the lights dimmed and the Capitol emptied into darkness, she'd walk the floor of her office and whisper the same words her grandmother used to say. Don't ever let them convince you that you don't belong somewhere you bled to reach. Those words weren't inspiration. They were armor. Jasmine's grandmother had scrubbed floors for rich families who wouldn't look her in the eye. She'd save coins in a jar marked education, even when there wasn't enough for food. It was her hands' wrinkled scar that had lifted Jasmine through law school, through protest, through pain. And it was her voice Jasmine heard the morning she left Dallas for D.C. Soft, trembling, but clear. Don't let them talk over you, baby. If they raise their voice, raise your truth. Now, every meeting Jasmine entered, she walked like she was carrying generations. She wasn't just a congresswoman. She was an indictment against the system that said women like her had to shout to be heard, had to smile while being erased. She studied harder, spoke sharper, never gave them a single comma to twist, and yet they still whispered, still tried her. But something in the air was shifting. The country was tired. The lies felt heavier. People were beginning to notice who kept showing up, who never flinched, who didn't back down. Jasmine had spent her whole life preparing for a moment she couldn't yet see, but she could feel it rising. Not as anger, but as clarity. And as the next vote on voter rights neared, she looked out her window at the city below, the working mothers, the tired teachers, the invisible laborers, and whispered not to them, but to herself. Let them test me. I've survived worse than words. What she didn't know was that the test was coming faster than she thought, and it would be televised. The hearing room was colder than usual, air thick with anticipation, the marble walls amplifying every breath like a drumbeat. Cameras were locked in place, red dots blinking like snipers in the rafters. Reporters leaned forward, waiting not for policy but for blood. This wasn't just legislation. It was war disguised in paperwork, and Jasmine Crockett sat dead center. The topic on the table, the American Voting Access Act, dry title, Lethal Implications. If passed, it would expand polling access in urban districts across Texas, Georgia, and Ohio. To Jasmine, it meant dignity for the voiceless. To others, it was a threat. The Greene surrogate representative Burke from the reddest part of Kentucky was already pacing like a dog about to bite. He leaned into his mic with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, I just have to say," Burke drawled, eyes narrowing in Jasmine's direction, "it's mighty interesting to hear from folks who decorate themselves in credentials, but can't even define what merit means. Guess law degrees come with lash extensions these days." The air snapped. A muffled gasp escaped the gallery. Chairs shifted. Pens stopped moving. Even the stenographer flinched. Jasmine didn't blink. She sat completely still, spine upright, hands folded on the table. Her expression didn't change, but inside the floor buckled. Not because it hurt she'd been called worse behind closed doors, but because it was so calculated, so public, and so familiar. Her grandmother's voice echoed in the back of her mind, gentle but firm. "You don't answer every dog that barks baby. Some bark because they know they can't bite." But Jasmine felt the heat rise in her chest anyway. Not for herself, but for every girl who looked like her watching at home. For every young black woman told that their intellect was decoration, that their voice was too much, that they were only ever allowed to exist between stereotypes. Burke smirked, proud of the silence. That was his mistake. The chairman banged the gavel. "The gentleman's comments will be stricken from the record." Too late. The damage had already exploded across live feeds. Staffers with cell phones caught the line before it was scrubbed. TikTok clips were already being sliced. Hashtags birthed in real time. The room tried to move on, but it couldn't. Jasmine hadn't even opened her mouth and the narrative had already shifted. She exhaled slowly, gaze locked forward. Her fingers grazed the edge of her notes, but didn't move. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation, timing. Every cell in her body screamed to strike back, to tear down his career in a single sentence. But instead, she did what her courtroom instincts always taught her: wait for the right moment. Let the fool keep talking. Let the nation lean in. Then finish him with the truth. A staffer behind her tapped his screen and whispered, "Ma'am, you're trending." She nodded once, not breaking her pose. The weight of millions of unseen eyes pressed against her shoulders now, not because she chose this fight, but because it found her. And in that moment, she understood something deep and terrifying. This wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was theater. It was test. It was trap. She could feel the eyes of every young attorney, every exhausted nurse, every underpaid teacher who looked like her waiting, not for rage, but for something they could hold on to. And Jasmine knew her next move wouldn't just speak for herself. It would echo across every room where someone was told they didn't belong. The city slept, but Jasmine didn't. Her apartment in D.C. was dark, save for the flicker of her tablet screen. Headlines spun across it like blades. Congressman's comment sparks uproar. Crockett stays, silent for now. Lash line or lifeline? The walls pulsed with the quiet tension of a war room. Her blazer still hung on the back of the chair untouched since she walked in. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't cried. She was past all that. Instead, she watched, not just the clip from the hearing, but older footage too. Greene's greatest hits, conspiracy-laced rants, QAnon nods, Jewish space lasers, 9/11 as an inside job. Jasmine took notes not just to respond, but to understand the architecture of delusion, the scaffolding of spectacle. If she was going to step into the fire, she wouldn't do it blind. She'd do it like a lawyer, like a daughter of Texas, like a Crockett. At 2:07 a.m., she closed the video, her breath shallow, her hands calm. She opened a folder labeled Federal Wins. 38 cases, 12 jury trials, 4 civil rights reversals on appeal. Her own life quantified in ink, not emotion. Then came the flashbacks. A judge who refused to call her counselor. A prosecutor who smirked as she fought to keep a teenage boy out of prison for stealing groceries. The chants outside courthouses, no justice, no peace. The mothers clutching her arm like she was the last tether to a world that cared. And through it all, the one constant, her grandmother's voice. She saw her again in memory, gray scarf, rough hands, laughter that could cut through the hardest day. "You don't fight with noise, baby. You fight with truth, dressed so sharp it makes them bleed." Jasmine closed her eyes. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. She was focused. Tomorrow, Burke and everyone watching would learn the difference between loud and lethal. She stood from the desk, cracked her neck, rolled her shoulders back. Then she spoke out loud, not rehearsing but remembering. My name is Jasmine Crockett. I earned my seat with blood, sweat, and a bar number. I read the Constitution before I ever raised my hand to swear on it. You want to talk about qualifications? Then come ready, because I don't miss. Her voice didn't shake. It soared. Downstairs, the city was still silent, but Jasmine knew the noise was coming, and this time she wouldn't be dragged into it. She'd shape it. She pulled her blazer from the chair, smoothed its creases, and stared out the window not at monuments, but at a horizon full of stories just like hers, waiting for someone to make the first cut through the fog. She picked up her pen not to write a speech, but to load the first round. Tomorrow she wouldn't shout. She wouldn't rage. She would do what she always did when backed against a wall, stand tall, speak clear, and drop truth like thunder. And as the clock ticked toward dawn, Jasmine whispered to herself the one question she couldn't shake. So when the moment comes tomorrow, what will I say next to make them listen? The next morning, the hearing room was a furnace disguised as ceremony flags, still but the air charged like a brewing storm. C-SPAN cameras lined the back wall like silent vultures, catching every twitch, every whisper, every weaponized glance. A fresh stack of witness statements rested in front of each representative, but no one cared about the paper. This wasn't about law. It was about control. Jasmine Crockett entered with the precision of a surgeon, measured calm, but carrying the weight of something unseen. She wore black today, not for mourning, but for memory. Her heels tapped softly on the marble floor, echoing louder than the morning's small talk. She took her seat without ceremony, eyes locked ahead, ignoring the deliberate coughs, the smirks, the shuffling of chairs, just a little too loud when she arrived. This was a stage now, and she knew it. Representative Burke was already there, flanked by aides, sipping something from a monogrammed tumbler. His smile lazy dangerous. He'd come ready to perform, not legislate. And he was watching Jasmine the way a pyromaniac watches the first spark. The committee chair began with routine procedure roll call, motions, acknowledgments, but even his voice betrayed the tension. Everyone could feel it, the thrum beneath the floorboards, the press of invisible eyes. Then the first witness was called. Burke interrupted before the oath was finished. Point of clarification, he said, not looking at the witness but at Jasmine. Just want to make sure the committee's time isn't wasted on perspectives from people who read talking points instead of legislation. A few staffers laughed, quiet, complicit. Jasmine didn't flinch. Not yet. 15 minutes and Burke struck again. I just find it amusing, he said to no one in particular, that some members think being loud and having a law degree makes you qualified to restructure America's election system. That's cute, but credentials aren't character. That did it. Jasmine felt her jaw tighten, not from offense, but from restraint. Her fingertips pressed against the wood table until the pressure creaked in her bones. This wasn't new. She'd heard variations of that line her whole life. Too loud, too black, too confident, too female, too educated to be palatable. The insult wasn't creative, but the silence it demanded was suffocating. She glanced briefly across the room. A young Latina staffer met her gaze. No words, just a flicker of solidarity. The committee chair again cleared his throat, asking members to focus on the issue at hand. But the issue was at hand, it just wasn't on paper. It was in the way Burke kept threading his sentences with implication, in the way other representatives either chuckled or stared at their hands. It was in how the air itself seemed to lean away from Jasmine, like her presence made the room recalibrate. Still, she didn't respond, because she wasn't here for Burke. She was here for every kid who'd ever been told they were too much to be taken seriously, for every woman who edited herself in real time just to survive a room, for her grandmother who never sat in such a chamber but raised a woman who could. And beneath that silence, something was rising, not fear, but precision, not fury, but control. Because if today was theater, then Jasmine Crockett was done playing audience. The chaos came fast, like a match dropped in a dry forest. Burke had just finished another tirade, this time louder, more reckless. He'd pivoted from policy to personal, waving a copy of the proposed bill in the air, as if it were a prop in his one-man play. It's real easy to scream voter suppression when you've never actually written a law that passed, he said, sneering at Jasmine without saying her name. But hey, some folks just come here for camera time, right? Laughter erupted from 2 seats down. A ripple of murmurs surged behind the witness table. The chairman's gavel banged, but it was background noise now. This wasn't order. It was theater spiraling toward spectacle. That's when Jasmine moved. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply adjusted the mic in front of her with the precision of someone flipping a switch and asked, "Mr. Chairman, may I briefly respond?" The room froze. Permission granted. No one exhaled. Jasmine leaned forward not in aggression, but in purpose. Her voice calm as steel sliced the tension like a scalpel. "I want to thank my colleague for reminding us how fragile merit feels to those who've never earned it." Burke's grin cracked. Jasmine didn't stop. "I graduated from the University of Houston Law Center. I've practiced civil rights law for over a decade. I've stood in federal courts, cross-examined hostile witnesses, and overturned wrongful convictions. I've read the Constitution out loud under oath and in courtrooms where lives were on the line." A pause. Then she looked straight at Burke. "So when someone accuses me of coming here for camera time, I suppose it's projection. Especially from someone who spent his first term Googling Jewish space lasers and asking if 9/11 was an inside job." The oxygen vanished from the room. No laughter, no coughing, no pens clicking. Just the sound of jaws tightening and the faint hum of a live broadcast feed catching every syllable. Jasmine didn't blink. She scanned the committee slowly, deliberately, as if measuring the weight of every silence that had ever sat in that chamber. "There are two kinds of power in this room," she continued. "There's volume and there's verification. One shouts because it can, the other speaks because it must. Today I choose the latter." The moment held, not because it was dramatic, but because it was exact. Not a wasted word, not a raised tone, just facts lined up like evidence and fired with surgical intent. Burke tried to speak. Nothing came out. His mouth opened then closed like a man realizing the water he stood in had turned to ice. Jasmine gently pushed her microphone away and folded her hands. The chairman cleared his throat, suddenly remembering procedure. The gentlewoman's time has concluded, but everyone knew. Time had stopped long enough for something to shift. The power of preparation had just demolished the politics of performance, and no one watching would ever forget it. The silence didn't break, it shattered. Burke's lips quivered, still searching for a comeback that had long since drowned beneath Jasmine's precision. His bravado dissolved like steam under pressure. No one came to his rescue. Not the freshman congressman to his right, who always echoed his talking points. Not the chair who quickly shifted the agenda with an unsteady voice. Even the stenographer hesitated before continuing, as if unsure whether to record the moment as testimony or history. Across the aisle, Democratic lawmakers sat taller, not smug, steady, like people who just watched a bridge finally burn behind them. One whispered "damn" under her breath. Another smiled without showing teeth, just pride traced in silence. Staffers in the back tried and failed to act normal. Phones discreetly filmed the last few seconds of Jasmine's takedown, their fingers already tapping out captions before the hearing even resumed. Outside the room, the world detonated. By the time Jasmine walked past the press pool, her name was already trending. Hashtag Crockett clapback hit Twitter's top 3 in under 7 minutes. TikTok edits sliced her remarks into reels drenched in music slow motion and fire emojis. CNN rolled the footage twice in 1 hour. MSNBC looped her final line like it was poetry. Even Fox News showed the clip but cut off the part about space lasers. In dorm rooms, in barbershops, in courtrooms, in classrooms, people watched with frozen coffees and open mouths. Not because they had never seen a woman speak truth, but because they had never seen someone do it so calmly, so surgically, and in a place that had tried so hard to mute voices like hers. And then came the shift. Behind closed doors, a staffer from Burke's own camp leaked an email just 6 words long. She crushed him. "We're changing tone." Speculation swirled. Was Burke being sidelined? Would Greene distance herself from the man she'd once called the fighter we need? Rumors fed headlines. Headlines fed narratives. But Jasmine didn't feed the flames. She declined CNN. She declined MSNBC. She even ghosted an offer from The Late Show. Her statement to the press was just 12 words. "I didn't speak to Tren. I spoke because silence was complicity." She went home that night to a quiet apartment and reheated pasta. No entourage, No champagne. Just her a pair of slippers and a voicemail from her grandmother's old pastor saying, "We saw what you did. And baby, you did it right." Yet even in solitude, Jasmine felt the weight shift. The hearing wasn't just another headline. It was a moment that cracked something open, something deeper than one insult, wider than one chamber. A reckoning of what power looks like when it isn't loud, white, or male. She had stood her ground and in doing so pulled the floor out from under them. As she stood by the window scrolling past videos of young girls lip-syncing her takedown like scripture, she whispered the one question now rattling through every corner of Washington. Once they've seen me, how can they ever ignore me or change the system? The next 72 hours were a blur of cameras, inboxes, and ringing phones. Jasmine's face was everywhere, CNN, MSNBC even. Good Morning America. Her speech played behind voiceovers like a highlight reel from a courtroom drama, except this time it wasn't fiction. It was her. Her words, her voice, her war. Donations flooded in by the minute. Over $300,000 in grassroots funding before sunrise. Her office voicemail filled with messages. "Thank you." Finally, someone said it. "You made my daughter believe she belongs." She should have felt victorious, empowered. But somewhere beneath the applause, something darker pulsed. In a private elevator ride the next day, a senior Democrat leaned in close and said, "Powerful moment, Jasmine, but we can't have too many more like that. Optics matter." Another warned her to stay in committee lanes. They didn't question the facts. They questioned the delivery, the tone, the audacity, as if the sharpest truths were too dangerous when delivered without permission. Republicans didn't bother with subtlety, emotional, unhinged. One Fox host said she looked like a woke prosecutor having a meltdown. But what stung worse were the quiet rebukes from within, whispers in corridors, cold glances in caucus meetings. A viral moment, it seemed, came with a cost. They cheered you publicly, then punished you privately. Jasmine kept smiling for the cameras, kept delivering press sound bites. But in the stillness between interviews, she felt it, the tightening in her chest, the invisible weight that came not from the fight itself, but from being expected to carry it alone. Every question now was double-edged. What's your next move? Who are you going after next? No one asked how she was sleeping. No one asked if the silence afterward had cut deeper than the noise. She stared into the mirror one morning and didn't see a congresswoman. She saw a performer rehearsing a role written by necessity, strong, composed, flawless. She missed the courtroom where truth had rules. She missed her grandmother whose praise never depended on polling data. She missed silence not as retreat but as refuge. That night she left a gala early. The ballroom had been full of people clapping, just a beat too long, smiling just a bit too wide. She climbed into her car, shut the door, and let herself breathe. No staff, no script, just the quiet hum of the engine and the raw hum of exhaustion. She remembered what it felt like to win a case that mattered, not for headlines, but for a boy who walked free, a mother who wept, a system that bent even if it didn't break. That feeling, that purpose had no cameras, no sound bites, just justice. Now she wondered if Congress would ever let her feel that again. Because in this new theater, every word was watched, every silence weaponized. And the same people who praised her for standing up were already measuring how small they could make her next. She leaned her head back against the seat and whispered to no one, "Is this the price of being seen or the punishment for not playing quiet?" It started as a whisper, then detonated like a mine under her feet. A far-right outlet posted a stitched-together montage of Jasmine's past clips. One from a 2022 protest, another from a tense committee hearing where she'd snapped back about her eyelashes, being realer than most policies in this room. Spliced into it all, an older clip of Marjorie Taylor Greene laughing off a wheelchair-bound voter and calling Jasmine Governor Hot Wheels a cruel jab meant to reduce both Crockett and the disabled community in one breath. But this time the fire wasn't aimed at Greene, it was aimed at Jasmine. Unprofessional, race baiter, just another angry black woman screaming for attention. The comments came fast like knives flung from every direction. YouTube threads, Reddit, Telegram groups, burner accounts on X. Some posted her home address. Others threatened to show up at her next town hall. One simply wrote, "We're watching. Every step. every breath. She scrolled in silence, heart pounding like a gavel screen, light flickering against her skin. In the past, she could shrug it off. Today it burrowed, not because she believed the lies, but because she knew the people who would. Across the country, anchors relit the same match. A Sunday morning host asked, "Has Congresswoman Crockett become too inflammatory to lead?" Another said, "There's a pattern of emotional outbursts here." They didn't mention the threats. They didn't mention the slurs. They didn't mention the fact that Greene had accused her of being a diversity hire 3 weeks earlier. They only mentioned volume, tone, optics. And under it all, Jasmine felt something crack. Not her strength, her stillness. She sat alone in her office that night, the Capitol glowing cold outside her window, and read a letter from a high school girl in Newark. "They say you're too loud, but your voice sounds like mine." She read it twice, then again, then folded it, placed it inside her wallet, and let the tears fall, not from weakness but from weight. The pain wasn't personal, it was ancestral. It was coded, inherited, broadcasted, and monetized. But then came the shift. Her staff, without asking, began calling it the reframe. They flooded the airwaves with facts, her legal victories, her community work, her unmatched attendance record. Civil rights groups released statements of support. Teachers began assigning her takedown as a rhetorical case study. Even a Republican strategist whispered on air, "You may not like her, but you can't beat her." Yet Jasmine knew better. This wasn't a battle of headlines. This was trench warfare with no front line, just shifting shadows and 1,000 tiny cuts aimed at her dignity. And still she rose. She walked back into that hearing room the next morning, head-high blazer, sharp heels echoing like a metronome of defiance. Every step was a refusal, every breath a rebuke, because she'd been through worse. And they still hadn't learned. You cannot smear someone whose truth was forged under pressure. But even as she took her seat composed and steady, one question still pulsed beneath her skin. How do you survive a fire that doesn't want to burn you, but erase you? By Thursday, Jasmine Crockett had stopped reading the headlines. Not because they stopped printing them, but because she had work to do. The kind that didn't trend, didn't clip well, didn't feed cable news. Bills sat stacked like barricades on her desk, each one a response to the world that told her to sit down and smile. So she did what courtroom training had taught her long before politics ever had bury. The noise build the case, and let the work speak louder than the wounds. She rewrote a section of the American Voting Access Act to expand ballot drop-off locations within low-income zip codes. She pulled in 2 moderate Republicans to co-sponsor a small business recovery package buried in committee gridlock. She called local organizers in Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, real voices from real streets, and asked them what they needed most. They didn't ask about clips. They asked about clinics, childcare, bus routes to polling places. And Jasmine delivered. She stopped showing up to every camera, but she showed up to every district call. She skipped late-night panel invites, but stayed until 2 a.m. editing clauses that could get another grandmother's light bill paid before eviction. Her fire hadn't gone out. It had changed form, from lightning to pressure, from eruption to precision. By week's end, the Capitol began murmuring, not just about her past, about her movement. A junior rep from Wisconsin whispered in an elevator, "She's turning this whole thing into votes." A longtime Democrat from Illinois told a colleague, "She's not a headline anymore. She's infrastructure." But the twist came from somewhere Jasmine didn't expect. An anonymous staffer leaked a note 3 lines from within Greene's inner circle. It read, the moment she stopped playing the media's game, Greene started losing control. She can't provoke her anymore. She's afraid of being irrelevant. Jasmine read it twice, not with satisfaction, with understanding. It wasn't just about her anymore. It never was. The tactic of provocation, insult to ignite outrage was failing, because Jasmine had stopped playing the part. She wasn't just reacting. She was replacing noise with strategy, volume with legislation, spectacle with service. Still, the war wasn't over. Outside protesters still waved signs. Trolls still camped in her inbox. Greene still made appearances louder than ever, but emptier now. The Capitol press corps started noticing the change. One wrote, "Crockett's not fading, she's evolving." Another, "When substance goes silent, spectacle feeds." But what happens when substance fights back inside her office? Jasmine leaned over her desk and circled the final clause of the housing equity bill. Her staff was asleep, the hallways quiet, the city for once still, and yet her mind raced not with fear but with clarity. Pain had knocked. She had answered, not with rage, but with purpose. And as she looked out at the Capitol dome, glowing in the distance, she allowed herself a single fierce thought. If they want to fight, will substance beat spectacle again? The applause outside never reached the back rooms. Behind the televised hearings and glowing headlines, the mood inside her own party had shifted quietly, deliberately, like a hand pulling the curtain closed. Jasmine entered that morning's closed-door caucus meeting with policy proposals under one arm and silent dread clenching her ribs. The room didn't hum, it pulsed. Glances darted but didn't land. Conversations paused when she walked in. Something had changed and she felt it like weather before a storm. A whip from the leadership team cleared his throat. "We're reviewing committee assignments," he said casually, like he wasn't about to rearrange the future in a sentence. "We need calmer voices on judiciary. Less heat, more consensus building." He didn't look at her. He didn't have to. A younger colleague leaned in and whispered, "They're icing you out, Jazz. Leadership's worried you're too volatile." Volatile. That word echoed like a slur dressed in committee speak. Not inaccurate, just unfair. They weren't punishing her for being wrong. They were punishing her for being unforgettable. Last month, they praised her for making the moment. Now they wanted her to disappear before the next one. In the hallway, another member offered a backhanded compliment with a donor smile. "We love your fire, Jasmine, but it's a little hot for where we're headed in Q3. Q3, they were treating courage like quarterly revenue, as if her voice was a risk index. She tried not to let it sting, but it did. Worse than Greene's barbs, worse than the trolls. Because this betrayal wore her party's lapel pin. Because these were the people who promised they had her back when she first ran. Now every room felt colder, every meeting shorter. She was being slowly rotated out, not fired, just forgotten. It was death by silence, and Jasmine knew silence better than anyone. She returned to her office that evening alone. The inbox was still overflowing with praise. Her district had just passed a local version of her small business bill. She was winning where it mattered most and losing where power played by different rules. Her staff tried to keep morale high. "They're just scared of your reach," one said. "You're making them look small," said another. But Jasmine knew it wasn't that simple. They weren't afraid of her fire. They were afraid of what it lit up, how clearly it revealed the dust in their doctrine, the comfort in their compromises. She didn't break party lines. She broke party rhythm. So she did what she always did, opened a fresh legal pad and wrote names, dates, notes. If they wouldn't give her the gavel, she'd build her own bench. If they locked her out of strategy meetings, she'd host roundtables in her district. If they denied her spotlight, she'd bring the sunlight to the street corners they never visited. She stared out at the Capitol under twilight and whispered to herself, not a vow, not a threat, a confirmation. If they think sidelining me keeps the peace, then they've misunderstood where the fire lives. It hit the news cycle like a precision strike at dawn. Marjorie Taylor Greene, never one to wait for silence, launched a new volley on live radio. "Jasmine Crockett, she's not here to legislate," Greene said, voice smooth with venom. "She's here to go viral. The Atlantic even said it undisciplined. How many bills has she passed again?" "That's right. She's all eyeliner and echo chambers." The clip exploded by midday. Fox News played it on loop, cropped over slow-motion footage of Jasmine, mid-gesture, frozen in a pose that felt more performance than policy. The framing was clear. She was being painted as the problem, the spectacle, the distraction. And now the narrative was slipping, not just from her hands, but from her control. Inside her office, Jasmine stared at the screen as the words rolled. Undisciplined, viral, angry. They weren't just attacks. They were surgical insults crafted to steal her legitimacy one syllable at a time. It wasn't the lies that hurt, it was the way they twisted the truth just enough to make the doubt believable. And worse, it worked. A centrist Democrat from Illinois texted her, "You should get ahead of this. Maybe do NPR lean wonky, shift the tone." Another suggested a soft focus interview with a Sunday magazine. "Humanize yourself a bit more," they said, like she hadn't already bled on national television just by being real. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not rage, but something more dangerous, the fear that maybe they were winning, that all her substance was being outpaced by the performance of those who never had any to begin with. Her staff watched her carefully. One finally broke the silence. "You want us to draft a rebuttal?" She didn't answer, not right away. Instead, she walked to the window, eyes locked on the Capitol dome gleaming against a darkening sky. She thought of her grandmother, of courtrooms, of every fight she entered where being loud meant losing, but being quiet meant disappearing. She thought of every girl watching, every young black law student writing her name into a notebook and whispering, "That's how I'll speak." She turned. "No rebuttal," she said quietly. "If I speak now, I validate her premise. I become what she's selling." But the headlines one aide protested. "She's not aiming for headlines," Jasmine cut in. "She's aiming for erosion. She wants me to drown in reaction while she builds the lie." They fell silent. She sat back at her desk and pulled a folder from the bottom drawer, a draft bill on restoring polling access in rural districts. Real work. Real consequence. No cameras. Greene could scream. She would legislate. And still, when night fell, when the staff had gone, when only the low buzz of Capitol generators hummed beneath her thoughts, Jasmine let the anger come. Crimson, precise quiet. Not because she wanted vengeance, but because she felt the stakes of restraint. She stared into the dark glass and asked the question echoing in every corner of her mind. If they keep lying about who I am, how long can I afford not to answer? The storm outside mirrored the one inside her. Rain lashed against the window of her apartment like it was trying to shake her loose from the walls. The Capitol lights blinked through the glass, blurred and tired. Jasmine sat at the kitchen table alone, shoes off blazer draped over the back of a chair, like a flag surrendered after battle. The screen in front of her glowed with notifications, mentions, clips, headlines, polls, all of them shouting. But in her mind there was only one voice. It was gravel-worn and honey-warm. Her grandmother's. She heard it not as memory, but as presence. The kind of presence that sat beside you even in silence. "Baby, don't ever confuse the noise for the mission. When they talk, let them. When you act, make sure it leaves a mark they can't scrub." She could still picture the old woman's hands wrinkled, worn, always moving. Folding laundry. Shelling peas. Holding Jasmine's cheeks the night she passed the bar. "We didn't come this far for claps," she'd said then. "We came to lift the ones still crawling." Jasmine leaned back in her chair, eyes heavy but burning. She could fight Greene right now. She could drop another viral line crush, another headline, send another ripple across the media floor. But what would it buy? A day, a dopamine hit. She'd seen it before. Flash applause fade. And she was done fading. She rose and crossed the room to the wall where her framed law degree hung beside a photo of her and her grandmother outside a polling station. Two women, two generations, one fight. Not for fame, but for future. Jasmine made her decision, not in words, but in motion. She grabbed a pen, pulled out the legislation she'd been refining on voting infrastructure grants, and began scribbling margin notes. She highlighted community reinvestment clauses, revised the language for federal protections in school board elections, rechecked the case law references for airtight defense. The next committee meeting would be about policy, not pettiness. And she'd make damn sure the work carried louder than the slander. She wouldn't tweet back. She'd write bills that couldn't be buried. She wouldn't beg for airtime. She'd build timelines the next generation could walk across. And when they asked where she'd gone, the answer would be simple. She never left. She just started speaking in results. The rain softened. The lights in her apartment dimmed. But a fire still burned quietly in her chest. Not for applause, not for spectacle, but for the small, invisible victories that change real lives. She looked once more at the blinking screen, then closed the laptop, and with a whisper not meant for the world, she asked herself, can I show them that real change is louder than viral moments? The Capitol halls buzzed with a different energy, now less fury, more focus. Jasmine Crockett moved through them like a force reshaping the very air, her strides purposeful, her eyes scanning for allies amid the noise. The battle had shifted from sharp words to sharper legislation, and she was ready to fight on every front. Her first victory was humble but vital, a bill expanding small business loans in underserved communities designed to breathe life into neighborhoods long ignored. She'd sat for hours in meetings with Republicans whose skepticism was wrapped in thinly veiled suspicion. But Jasmine spoke their language, facts, numbers, stories from the women who ran corner stores and daycare centers in her district. Slowly, brick by brick, walls lowered. "Your constituents have my attention," said Senator Caldwell from Kansas, his tone cautious but genuine. "Let's see if we can get this through." That was all Jasmine needed. In another room across the aisle, she navigated a labyrinth of committee discussions on voting rights. The challenge was enormous. Expanding polling locations in minority neighborhoods meant overturning decades of neglect masked as security. But she didn't flinch. She held up maps, demographics, testimonials from elders who'd waited hours in line just to cast their ballots. She saw the resistance in faces, the subtle shifts of discomfort when history stared them down. Yet in those moments, she chose empathy over anger. "We're talking about access," she reminded them quietly, "not advantage. We're talking about restoring trust where it's been broken." Bipartisan meetings became her crucible. Long hours of negotiation, patience, worn-thin arguments, punctuated by weary smiles. Each concession felt like a battlefield scar, necessary but costly. Still, with every handshake, every nod, she knew progress was inching forward. But the tension never fully left the room. The ghosts of partisan battles past lingered in sideways glances and the tight grip of pens over notes. Jasmine felt the weight of expectations, not just to deliver, but to unite, to prove that collaboration could triumph over division. Back in her office, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and handwritten notes, Jasmine allowed herself a rare moment of hope. The pieces were moving. Allies were found. Her voice, once dismissed as too loud, too angry, was now echoed in votes and quiet agreements. Yet beneath that hope, a simmering awareness pulsed. The fight was far from over. The victories so far were footholds, not summits. Opponents lurked, ready to pounce on any fracture. But Jasmine's resolve was unshaken. She stared out at the city skyline, the same city that had birthed her fight, and whispered, "This is only the beginning." And as the Capitol lights glimmered in the dusk, a question hung in the air, waiting to be answered. Can hope built on compromise withstand the storms ahead? The tides were turning, and Marjorie Taylor Greene felt the shift like a cold wind cutting through her carefully constructed armor. Rumors swirled through the Capitol halls before they became official. Greene was losing her committee assignments again. Leadership, exhausted by her endless controversies and the growing embarrassment they brought, had made a choice. The once fiery provocateur who thrived on chaos and headlines was being sidelined. News broke in the afternoon, cascading through social media and political talk shows like a verdict. The headlines were stark: Greene stripped of committee roles amid controversies. Demotion signals: waning influence for Georgia representative. For the first time in months, Greene's voice was muted, not by choice, but by consequence. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett watched the developments with a measured nod. Her own victories, bills passed by partisan coalitions, formed, stood in sharp contrast to Greene's spiraling isolation. Where Greene's name was now synonymous with scandal, Jasmine's was becoming a beacon of change. In a quiet moment after a long committee session, Jasmine's chief of staff shared the news. There was no celebration, no gloating, just a steady acknowledgement of the significance. "This means the system is still holding some ground," Jasmine said softly. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, slow, deliberate, and undeniable. Meanwhile, the public's reaction was electric. Online forums buzzed with approval. Grassroots activists celebrated Jasmine's work, sharing clips of her speeches side by side with Greene's latest missteps. Local newspapers ran editorials praising the quiet persistence of legislation over the noise of theatrics. But for Greene, the setback was more than symbolic, it was personal. The power to intimidate, to dominate discourse, to shape the narrative had slipped through her fingers. Whispers in her camp spoke of frustration, of plans to rally her base through louder, more extreme rhetoric. Yet the cracks were visible even to her fiercest supporters. Jasmine, meanwhile, felt a momentary release, a breath drawn deep after a marathon race. She allowed herself a rare smile, not at Greene's fall, but at the possibility that substance might finally reclaim space from spectacle. Yet she knew this was no finish line. The Capitol was a battleground littered with fallen giants and rising stars. The next fight would be harder, quieter, and perhaps more defining. As she prepared her next bill, Jasmine glanced at a framed photo on her desk, a moment captured months ago, of her and her grandmother, hands clasped tight. She drew strength from it, because this was the true victory when persistence turns the tide, and the voices of justice echo louder than the shouts of division. And beneath it all, a steady question remained pulsing like a heartbeat in the dark. When the noise fades, will justice still be heard? The invitation came wrapped in gold, a gleaming ticket to primetime glory at the National Convention, a stage built for headlines, virality, and meteoric political ascension. Jasmine Crockett stared at the elegantly scripted words, her heart tightening with anticipation and suspicion. Cameras, applause, millions watching. This was precisely the spectacle she'd learned to mistrust. "You can't pass this up," her communications director urged, softly sensing her hesitation. "This is your moment." Yet Jasmine felt a gnawing unease, the instinctual caution of someone who'd seen behind the curtain of manufactured fame. This stage wasn't just an opportunity, it was bait. They wanted her in a box labeled Rising Star, where her voice could be contained, commodified, and ultimately discarded. Instead, Jasmine chose to rewrite the script entirely. She announced a nationally broadcasted town hall, unscripted, unfiltered, authentic. No teleprompters, no stage-managed applause. Just her, a microphone, and a live audience of real voters whose lives hung in the balance of policy. Her decision stunned political insiders, drawing murmurs of both admiration and disbelief across Capitol Hill. "It's too risky," one veteran senator warned her privately, his eyes serious. "Without a controlled message, you're handing your enemies ammunition." "I know," Jasmine replied calmly, "but truth doesn't need scripts." When the night arrived, the hall brimmed with nervous energy, young students, working-class mothers, skeptical retirees, their faces etched with cautious hope. Cameras buzzed, capturing the raw anticipation. Jasmine stepped forward, her posture firm, eyes bright with determination. Questions surged forward, difficult, pointed, uncomfortable. Jasmine didn't dodge. She embraced each one head-on, meeting frustration with empathy, anger with acknowledgement, skepticism with unwavering honesty. She detailed her bills, laid out her successes and struggles, and listened deeply to every voice that spoke. "Politics shouldn't be a spectacle," she declared, her voice ringing clear. "It's a promise to listen, to fight, to deliver. Tonight you hold me accountable." The town hall's impact was immediate and electric. Headlines erupted, not praising Jasmine's performance, but marveling at her courage to step outside the polished conventions of politics. #real leadership trended alongside clips of genuine exchanges, drowning out orchestrated attacks. In quiet solitude afterward, Jasmine exhaled relief tinged with pride. She'd refused to become another package star, choosing instead a harder, more authentic path. Her grandmother's voice echoed softly in her memory. "Real power isn't about applause, baby. It's about who you're willing to fight for." Yet beneath her quiet triumph lingered a shadowy premonition, a sense that this genuine moment had just painted a new target on her back. And she wondered silently, when authenticity threatens power, how fierce will the backlash become? The backlash struck swiftly, like lightning shattering an otherwise calm horizon. A sudden press release, strategically timed, announced a damning independent audit alleging massive budget mismanagement tied directly to Jasmine's landmark voting rights legislation. The accusations exploded into headlines, weaponizing doubt and fear overnight. Crockett's bill faces fraud allegations. Voting rights champion embroiled in fiscal scandal. Jasmine's phone erupted with frantic calls, colleagues demanding explanations, supporters anxious for reassurance, opponents sensing vulnerability. Her heart hammered as she read through the twisted narrative, a carefully engineered ambush hiding behind spreadsheets and deliberately vague language. In the Capitol, whispers echoed louder than ever. Once supportive colleagues now hesitated, their eyes avoiding hers in hallways. The air felt colder, heavier. "This could sink us all," warned a party strategist grimly, as if her honesty had become contagious, dangerous. At a hastily convened emergency meeting, Jasmine faced a room crackling with tension. "This audit isn't about truth," she stated calmly, eyes scanning faces riddled with doubt. "It's a calculated strike against progress. They fear the change we're making." "But the optics," one senior advisor pressed urgently. "We need immediate damage control. Apologies, reassurances, something." Jasmine's eyes hardened. "No," she said sharply. "We fight this with facts, not apologies. I won't validate their lies with retreat." Yet privately doubts clawed at her chest. Was truth enough? Could honesty survive in a landscape designed to bury it under layers of scandal and sensationalism? She felt the crushing weight of responsibility not only to her constituents, but to every young girl who saw her as proof they could belong. That evening, Jasmine stood before a packed community center in South Dallas, faces anxious yet hopeful. She spoke slowly, firmly, unflinchingly, laying out the truth behind the accusations. She reminded them who benefited from sowing doubt, not the voters, but those desperate to retain power by silencing voices like theirs. "They attack what threatens them," she declared, voice clear, despite trembling hands hidden from view. "Tonight they're afraid of us. They're afraid because they see what happens when people refuse to be silent." Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then stronger, a tide of renewed determination washing through the room. Leaving the stage, Jasmine felt relief tempered by clarity. The fight ahead would be ruthless, exhausting. Enemies she'd underestimated were mobilizing with new fervor, exploiting every crack, every whisper. But this was her battleground, forged from battles fought in courtrooms, campaign trails, and community meetings long before national headlines ever noticed. As the moon rose over Dallas, Jasmine whispered into the night, not a prayer but a promise. When truth faces its fiercest test, how many will stand by it and who will fade away? The weight of doubt settled heavy on Jasmine's shoulders, but she refused to buckle. Inside the marble corridors of Congress, whispers of hesitation circled once again, quiet doubts about her ability to lead through this storm. Some colleagues urged caution, others urged silence, fearing the controversy would sink not just the bill, but her rising star. Yet Jasmine knew the only way forward was through fire, not around it. She gathered her closest allies in a small conference room, faces etched with concern, yet shining with determination. The community leaders she trusted most called in from across the country, their voices raw but resolute, reminding her who she fought for. Not just legislation, but lives. Drawing on their stories, their struggles, Jasmine found fuel for the battle ahead, blending empathy with a simmering anger that refused to be silenced. At the podium under the glaring lights of a packed committee, hearing Jasmine stood tall. Her voice carried the weight of personal sacrifice, a mother's anxiety, a grandmother's lessons, a community's hope. She wove policy arguments with piercing clarity, cutting through misinformation with facts and unshakable conviction. But more than that, she called for unity, an appeal not to party lines, but to shared humanity. Her speech was a tapestry of resolve and grace, anger and hope interlaced in every phrase. She reminded the room that voting rights were not a partisan game. They were the foundation of democracy itself. As her words echoed through the chamber, the tension shifted. Eyes that once doubted now watched with something closer to respect, if not agreement. When she stepped down, a quiet murmur rippled through the audience. Jasmine knew the fight was far from over, but tonight she had reclaimed the narrative. Tonight, leadership was not about loud declarations or viral moments. It was about standing firm, speaking truth, and carrying the voices of those who could not. The chamber buzzed with tension, every heartbeat syncing with the ticking clock. Jasmine stepped to the podium, poised as a coiled spring, eyes scanning a sea of skeptical faces. Opponents lurked ready to pounce with pointed questions and veiled insults aiming to rattle her composure. But Jasmine's voice rang clear, steady, resolute, as she recounted her journey, a lawyer who fought injustice, in courtrooms a daughter of communities silenced too long, and a relentless advocate for voting rights. Her credentials weren't just words, they were lifelines thrown across a divide. As the debate surged, her opponents grew louder, their tactics sharper, attempting to bait her into missteps. Yet she remained unshaken, delivering her message with unwavering clarity. Stories of mothers waiting hours to vote, small business owners struggling against systemic barriers in neighborhoods, denied their rightful say, cut through the political noise. The chamber's atmosphere shifted, rising and falling, like waves, hope flickering in some eyes, uncertainty creeping into others. Just when the battle seemed destined for stalemate, a hush fell. A senator from across the aisle rose, unexpected, deliberate. The room held its breath as the senator declared support for Jasmine's bill, crossing the bitter divide to join her coalition. The impact was immediate. Murmurs swelled into applause and stunned glances exchanged among allies and adversaries alike. The tide had turned. Relief flooded Jasmine's chest, warm and exhilarating. Hope blossomed in the faces of those who had fought beside her. Long nights, relentless pressure, and countless obstacles culminating in this defining moment. Solidarity, once fragile, now surged through the chamber, a fierce testament to perseverance and truth. As the gavel echoed, signaling the vote's end, Jasmine's mind echoed a single powerful question, one that would ripple far beyond these marble walls. In the end, whose courage changed the outcome? The dust had barely settled when Jasmine Crockett stepped into the quiet eye of the storm. The vote was done. Legislation passed, but this wasn't the end. It was the first crack in a wall decades thick, the beginning of a reckoning long overdue. She stood beneath the towering columns of the Capitol, shadows stretching like fingers across the marble floor, and felt the weight of what had just been won and what still hung in the balance. In neighborhoods, once forgotten whispers turned to roars. Small businesses shuttered by neglect now flickered to life, neon signs piercing through the darkness like beacons of hope. Polling stations that were once battlegrounds of barriers became battlegrounds of ballots. Faces she knew, mothers, students, elders, carried a new light in their eyes, a fierce promise born from months of relentless fight. But victory tasted bitter too. The fight had left scars, fractured alliances, bruised egos, relentless enemies lurking in the wings. The air crackled with unspoken threats and the promise of counterattacks. Jasmine's mind raced, replaying every confrontation, every cold shoulder in the halls, every whispered warning that this triumph would be met with fierce resistance. Gratitude welled up fierce and raw, not for glory, but for survival. For every hand that reached out, every voice that rose despite the odds. Relief threatened to wash over her like a tidal wave, but she held it back. Because in the shadows of victory, the real war was just beginning. She recalled the long nights hunched over bills and briefs, the fiery debates that nearly broke her spirit, the moments when silence threatened to swallow her whole. Now those moments fueled her. Every step forward was a battle won, but the battlefield stretched far beyond the Capitol steps. Outside, the city pulsed with life, a living testament to what could be changed, but also to what still demanded fight. Jasmine clenched her fists, eyes burning with determination. She wasn't done, not by a long shot, and as the sky darkened, a single searing question cut through the quiet. How many more battles will it take before justice stops being the fight and becomes the foundation? The victory was real, but the war was far from over. Jasmine Crockett stood at the window of her office, eyes fixed on the sprawling city below. The streets buzzed with life and unrest, a reminder that the laws passed today were but one step on a long, arduous journey. Racial justice still demanded fierce battles. Climate crises loomed like dark clouds on the horizon. Healthcare gaps yawned wide, threatening the most vulnerable. And in the shadows, Greene and other opponents waited, ready to strike again. Jasmine's breath was steady, her resolve sharpened by the challenges ahead. She understood now more than ever that progress wasn't a straight line. It was a relentless climb up a mountain, constantly reshaped by resistance. Humility tempered her confidence. Victories were never just hers to claim. They belonged to the communities fighting alongside her, to the mothers and children whose futures depended on relentless advocacy. She gathered her team, her voice calm but fierce. "We've broken ground," she said, "but the foundation still needs building." Plans unfolded, new coalitions to form, policies to draft, voices to amplify. Every setback was a call to double down, every challenge a summons to fight smarter. Alone later, Jasmine allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The weight of responsibility pressed heavy, but so did a fierce readiness to carry it forward. She was no longer just a survivor of battles past. She was a leader forging the path ahead. As night wrapped the city in its embrace, a single question lingered in her mind, steady, unyielding. When the fight never ends, how do you stay ready to lead? The camera's lens held Jasmine's gaze steady, unflinching, a mirror to every soul watching. She didn't speak of triumph, born from noise or fury. Instead, her voice was quiet, resolute. I didn't win because I screamed louder. I won because I earned it with empathy, preparation, truth. Each word carried the weight of battles fought in silence, the lives behind every law, the hope sewn into every clause. Around her, the world buzzed with spectacle, louder voices, flashier moments, viral outbursts, but Jasmine's victory stood apart. It was a beacon for what real leadership demands: substance over showmanship, courage over clamor. She believed in a truth that transcended headlines, the power of every story, every voice, every struggle that stitched together the fabric of justice. Her eyes softened as she leaned closer, inviting not just applause but reflection. Leadership isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about carrying the weight others won't, standing firm when no one's watching, and lifting up those who've been pushed down. The room seemed to breathe with her words, a silent chorus of hope and challenge. Then, with a quiet intensity, she posed the question that lingered like a flame in the dark. So in your life, when someone doubts you, how will you show them you belong? It wasn't just a challenge to those in power, but a call to every person watching to rise, to persist, to claim their place. The frame held for a moment longer, capturing the fierce humility of a woman who knew leadership was never about spectacle. It was about heart, grit, and unwavering truth. Then the screen faded, leaving the question echoing in the minds of millions. In that silence, the story became theirs. The fight became ours. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.